All right. Hello, everybody. We are going to be looking at Foner pages 58 to 67 today for our flipped classroom video. If you don't have the 5th edition, go by the subject heading, New Englanders Divided. So we're going to get started by talking about religious dissenters. We'll talk about Roger Williams first and then talk about Anne Hutchinson. So it's important before we get into Roger Williams to understand the limitations of freedom and liberty in the New England colonies. We already had a question on this, but Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson are really key examples to consider here. So we already know that most of the early settlers of New England were religious, and their different religious opinions caused dissent. And these were key examples of the social instability that plagued the colonies. So Roger Williams is a great example of this. For one, he was a separatist. Remember that most Puritans were not separatists and believed that the church could be reformed from within. So already he was a minority. Another irony here is that the Puritans thought that there should be an emphasis on individual interpretation of the Bible, but that kind of caused frictions between different Puritans because leaders obviously needed church membership to still be up to justify their positions, but others thought that if individual interpretation of the Bible was really the way to demonstrate one's faith, that going to church wasn't necessarily the way to achieve salvation. So Williams disagreed with the theoretical government setup of New England, which we've already talked about. He actually thought that the church and the state should be separated, and that individuals didn't even have to be Puritans to be voting citizens. And he also rejected the idea that the Puritan faith was the one true faith. So he was tolerant of religions outside of Puritanism entirely. Remember when we were scrutinizing the idea of freedom and liberty in New England, one of the biggest examples of this was that really you were only free, quote unquote, if you were a Puritan. So if Roger Williams would welcome people outside of the Puritan faith, this was seen as a huge threat by Puritan leaders. So he was put on trial and ultimately banished from Massachusetts in 1636, and he moved to Rhode Island, where he established his own colony. And right at the outset, it allowed for religious freedom, and there was no one established church. And it's important because, in theory, that would allow any settler to vote regardless of religion. And it was also more democratic in the sense that elections and town meetings took place more frequently. There were a few other examples of how dissenters formed new colonies. Hartford was actually similar to Rhode Island, Hartford in Connecticut, because you didn't have to belong to the church to vote. And New England is an interesting example of religious dissenters setting up a new colony, because New Haven actually was founded because they thought that some of the settlements were too liberal in Massachusetts. In particular, Yale was founded because they thought that the divinity program at Harvard was a little bit too liberal and progressive. When we talk about Anne Hutchinson, this is an interesting opportunity to bring gender roles into the conversation about religious dissent. So Hutchinson, again, she's a really good example of how, well, ultimately she sort of defied gender roles, right? And that made her out to be a threat to the theocratic system in Massachusetts. So first, she held religious meetings in her home, not the church. And remember that in Massachusetts, towns were centered around the church, so this was seen as a huge act of defiance. She also had meetings that combined men and women, and traditional gender roles at the time frowned upon this, right? That generally men met together and women met together separately. She also claimed that she could communicate directly with God, and that was seen as a huge threat to church leaders, because if you could communicate directly to God, then why should a church exist in the first place? And she also believed that the way people achieve salvation was through inner grace. There was just something about your character, your inner salvation, your interpretation of the Bible. It was not about going to church. It was not about just going through the rituals and the motions. So this also angered clerical leaders because it, again, went against the very need for the church to exist. So Anne Hutchinson was accused of something called antinomianism, and that was the idea that she used her own personal judgment over church teachings. And she was put on trial for something called sedition, which is basically expressing an opinion that was seen as dangerous against authority, and she was banished from Massachusetts in 1637. And Foner doesn't tell you where she ends up. She actually goes to Rhode Island for a period of time, and we already talked about why Rhode Island was significant. So the big takeaway question here, what do the narratives of Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams tell us about freedom and liberty and its limits in the New England colonies? Let's move on to talk a little bit about the waning relationship between New England colonists and local indigenous peoples. So, to compare to Virginia, the New England coastal regions were not nearly as densely populated with indigenous people. So, a part of that was actually because disease epidemics already started to ravage the population of the New England region. So, when the coastal regions, when the first European settlers arrived, they did not really come in contact with indigenous people right away. Another thing that's interesting here is that the New England colonies grew a lot faster than Virginia. By 1700, the population of white settlers in New England was about 90,000. So because the population grew so fast, they needed more and more land, and that made conflict with indigenous people more likely. A really big exception to this was Roger Williams. When he founded New England, which we already talked about, he purchased land from the local Narragansett people. And in most other parts of New England, the land was just taken. So that's a big difference. Leaders of New England emphasized in general order and conformity. They believed that any kind of commingling with indigenous people could be a threat, and people who did have any relations with indigenous people could be sentenced to harsh punishments such as hard labor if they tried to associate or live with Indians. Another thing, captivity narratives became very popular literature at the time, essentially journals and reflections of people who were kidnapped and held captive by Indians. But what's interesting is that the most famous one written by Mary Rowlandson, she actually accounts in her narrative about how she wasn't treated cruelty, but the book was still published and used in a way to try to otherize her captives and stress how important it was to remain faithful to the Puritan church. So in general, captivity narratives were seen as a cautionary tale. Do not associate with indigenous people. That was sort of the message there. Another element of the waning relation between white settlers and indigenous peoples in New England, we could talk about the Pequot War, really just ultimately decimated the Pequot population in Connecticut in a very short amount of time. So we already said the New England indigenous population already wasn't as large as Virginia, and as the population of English settlers starts to grow, conflict with indigenous people became more and more likely. So what's interesting is the Pequot War, it did start because the Pequots killed a local fur trader, but arguably the retaliation was much harsher and much more violent and brutal. Connecticut and Massachusetts soldiers band together and they burned down a local Pequot town, and it killed 500 people, including women and children and the elderly. And it's also interesting because the Connecticut and Massachusetts soldiers actually allied with the Narragansett people of Rhode Island, who were rivals of the Pequots. And there is a general pattern here of white settlers using local indigenous rivalries to their advantage. We'll see that again when we get to the French and Indian War. Within a few months after the start of the Pequot War, the Pequots were virtually wiped out of Connecticut, and that allowed white settlers to expand vastly into the region. Another thing that we should take away from the Pequot War is it set a really dangerous precedent because it was clear to indigenous peoples that white settlers were willing to use violence to pave the road for expansion. Last slide here, we'll talk a little bit more about economic growth in New England. So it's interesting because the initial motives to settle New England was in general religious, right? The freedom from religious persecution in England, but they still did seek economic opportunities. So we'll see how that affects religion in just a second here. There was a more even distribution of wealth in New England than there was in the large plantation society that was developing in southern colonies like Virginia. But still, it was not equal by any means. There was still a substantial presence of indentured servants and slaves. So you did see economic inequality in New England, just not as much as that plantation system that became even more unequal with the head right system, where wealthier people could buy just vast tracts of land. And because in New England, servants, and actually everywhere in the colonies, servants could not own land. In New England, that had a more acute effect on their freedom, because if you couldn't own land, you couldn't vote. And also, if you didn't own land, you didn't belong to the church, which is why you couldn't vote. So This inequality also impacted, the ability to actually freely participate in a democratic society. And thus, it wasn't a true democracy, one could say. The economic growth was very much fostered by an extensive trade network, notably with the West Indies and Europe. And that laid the foundation for what's called a triangular trade, where you see this interdependence. You really can't see that slide too well, sorry. You'll be able to see it more if you pull up the slides on Power School. But this relationship where all these different regions rely on another for a certain product that they don't have in their own local region. And as the New England colonies grew, this starts to contribute to a decline in church membership. Residents became less concerned with their faith and more concerned with their work. This was particularly true for younger generations. Some of them, to make more money, they were willing to work on Sundays, for example, and that was seen as a sacrilegious act for more faithful people who believed that Sunday was the Sabbath, the day of rest. The church tried to resolve this issue. They were losing so many members that they came up with the Halfway Covenant of 1662. And essentially it allowed for people to be baptized and enjoy some of the benefits of church membership. And they wanted to do this again to keep church membership up. But even with the Halfway Covenant, church membership gradually started to decline. And that's also going to happen because as New England grows, it's not going to be exclusively Puritan anymore. Real irony here to close with is that Puritans actually stress hard work as a way to demonstrate their faith. It's part of this greater Protestant work ethic that you may know about if you studied more European history. So the emphasis on hard work might have actually ironically been the cause for the decline in church membership in New England. So that basically sums up what you read about for Foner for today. I hope this video was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.